watching Maximilian on Maximilian TV, and I'm an author, among many other things. And my latest book is called Afterlife. It's book 2, and bedtime stories for the intellectually adventurous. And I'm going to read you the first 2 chapters. It's available now on Amazon, and it's coming soon to iBooks. This is a live stream, so if it goes, it's just the nature of the beast, but I'm always working to make my videos better. Please feel free to leave comments. While I'm reading, of course I'm not going to stop and read the comments, but as soon as I'm finished, I'm going to roll on over to my computer and I'm going to look at the comments and I will answer questions or whatever. If anyone's hanging around, we can chat. So I'll keep it open for a little while when I'm finished. Without further ado, let me begin. This is from my book, Afterlife. The first chapter is titled, Less Than Zero. Los Angeles, California, 2026. The City of Angels is an ironic nickname for a town with a reputation for being full to the brim with liars, fakes, and assholes. Every year, thousands of people from all over the world immigrate to Los Angeles. Over 14,000 people arrive every month to try to make their way, either in Hollywood or just to someplace with better weather. Immigrants to Los Angeles give up their proximity to family, and in some cases, spouses, children, and lifelong friends, to pursue their dream of fame, wealth, or just a fucking job that pays decent money. They sacrifice a lot just to get there. Some of them find their way. Others get distracted in the den of life as a waiter at BOA, and entirely forget that they came to Los Angeles to pursue an artistic career. And it's these people who are the assholes. It's the guy who moved away from his mom, his high school sweetheart, and his hometown, who misses his family but can't afford to fly home and doesn't want to tell them how broke he is. So he makes up a story about booking a job and cries himself to sleep at night because he can't make it home for Christmas for another year in a row. That guy. The 20-something-year-old singer who makes the cut to producers every time, who makes the cut all the way to producers every time she auditions, but in the final round consistently gets passed over because instead of working with a voice coach during the day, hustling for a good agent, and hitting all the musical theater and award show auditions like she swore she would when her parents took out that second mortgage on their home to get their little girl to Hollywood, she picks up extra shifts at her hostessing job to make her rent. And because she has a roommate and feels self-conscious about her loud singing, she doesn't rehearse her. And all the Rico Suave sharks who swam all the way to Mexico, London, and Brazil to discover they were just guppies. Each of them, too. All of these tender-minded people, and others like them, full of angst and mad at the world, because their choose-your-own-adventure story just took an unexpected turn and landed them on an inauspicious-looking page. These are the ones who cut in line at the ATM, pretending not to realize what they've done. That's the guy who sees another car's turn signal and drags his car ahead just those few inches to let the other driver know that he's not letting anybody in. That's the haughty woman screaming at the manager of the restaurant. That's the insolent waiter who doesn't give a fuck that he got your order wrong. And that is his lackadaisical manager who doesn't care enough to offer so much as a glass of champagne in condolence. And it's the rude lady at the gym, and the condescending receptionist, and the snarly talent agent, and every petulant waitress annoyed that you sat down in her section to eat a meal. All of them. Not native assholes, but asshole implants, and suffering clearly. They paid dearly just to be in Los Angeles, and each day that it doesn't seem to be working out the way they'd like, they die a little bit inside and hate everyone else for it. It's different for an Angelino. For a person native to Los Angeles, traffic is just traffic. It's not bad, it just is. And it comes as no surprise. Mom and Dad, if they're still around, are just a drive away. Ditto high school sweethearts and childhood friends. Having to move back home just means 3rd Street and Fairfax Avenue. Less privacy, but otherwise, no big deal. And the neighborhood, if it's changed a lot, has only gotten better. It's the end of summer, and the weather is warm but not dry. Thousands of delicate purple trumpet flowers cover the sidewalks in the little neighborhood, tucked into a discreet triangle between Sweetser and La Cienega, where Jimmy Jennings is in bed, alone. It's a one-bedroom affair with a formal dining room that's been converted to a library. More like a magazine room, really. Only the latest issues. All the good ones are there. Wine Aficionado, The New Yorker, W Magazine, Details, Wired, Rolling Stone, Dwell, Martha Stewart. The ivory pleated curtains that used to hang in the arched floor-to-ceiling window now reside in a box in the basement, with the other decorations and redundant house things Jimmy unceremoniously stored away in 2006 when his father finally died, the gnarled old thing, and left Jimmy the house. It was the same one he grew up in. They hadn't been poor, but Jimmy hadn't been an expected child, and while things hadn't been tight financially, the Jennings couldn't afford to move into a bigger house in the same neighborhood, and they didn't want to move into a less affluent area. So, when Jimmy turned 6, his mother and his father, together, helped him make his bedroom in the basement. When Jimmy moved away, Mr. and Mrs. Jennings left everything in situ, which is how Jimmy found it when he returned to stake his claim. Initially, he put the house on the market, but after a very short time, he decided it wasn't a seller's market after all, and moved into the house himself. Most of his parents' valuable things were bequeathed away. He didn't consider himself to be a particularly sentimental person, and had sold what valuable things were left, but there were a few odds and ends, nostalgic artifacts that could later be valuable, and other things which he hadn't a use for right then, but that he might want later. There was a creepy old storage closet under the stairs in the basement where he stored the unloved but still wanted things, like the curtains. Without the austere curtains obscuring all the light, the formal dining room became a literary oasis. The original hardwood floors throughout the entire house beamed in the unfiltered sunlight. A honey-colored tufted leather sofa from Restoration Hardware, flanked by brass coffee tables, lamps, and a vintage reproduction of the earth, as told by Horchow, were arranged, not against the wall, but in the center of the room. There were books in the bookcases, but not many. This was the room of a man who lives for the moment. Unfortunately, Jimmy Jennings was a man whose moment had passed. Chapter 0. Jimmy Jennings realized what had happened the moment he woke up without being in excruciating pain. It was, of course, too much to hope that after so many years of being ineffective, the pain medication he'd been taking had finally worked, so he'd understood his situation before he even sat up and looked around. He was dead. He lay in bed, alone. Jimmy stood looking down at himself, still handsome, but still a withered old man. No more movie star good looks. If he'd ever had them, they'd faded away as he'd slept. Looking at his situation, it was plain to see that Jimmy had been a man in a coma. The first clue to this was that Jimmy and his bed were set up in the living room. By the looks of things, it had been set up this way for a long time. It was a more comfortable setup for his caregiver, wherever she was, for sure. The bedroom in the house was small, and while any caregiver would want to be near enough to keep a watchful eye, she'd certainly want some of her own air to breathe. A wing-back chair with its own little lamp and table sat in a cluster some distance away from the bed but angled to face it, making a quick glance to check on the bed's inhabitant, convenient and unobtrusive. There were a few items around. There were a few personal items around, but not many. A few interesting paintings by unknown artists decorated the walls. Modern rugs from Z Gallery, which Jimmy remembered buying, added a finishing touch, pulling the look together with a pop of color from the floor. A modern bouquet of fresh-cut flowers with long spiraling twigs and impossibly long sprigs of rosemary took up most of the space on a small, round dining table across the room. There were only 2 chairs. From where he stood in his own living room, Jimmy turned a circle looking around his home. He wasn't sorry he'd died. He'd been asleep so long that he didn't remember himself. But before he went on into the next life, he wanted to give some sort of thanks for the one that he'd had, if only he could remember anything. Jimmy walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Old takeout. Fried chicken. Jimmy rolled his eyes. People these days will eat anything. He couldn't wait to see what his home care worker looked like. Next to the cardboard chicken box was a bag from the chicken place. Sides. Jimmy pulled at his chin, trying to guess at what sides a home care worker would pick at a greasy chicken place. Obviously not something healthy. Even the collard greens at these places were riddled with little bits of pork fat and meat. He pulled the lower corner of his mouth to the side in contemplation, hoping that his bedside companion wasn't one of those delusional people who believed that the effects of the fried chicken would be nutritionally neutralized by choosing something like overboiled corn and a weak-ass iceberg lettuce salad as sides. He opened the bag. 2 large sides. Macaroni and cheese and macaroni and cheese. Crappy food, but he could appreciate the spirit of the meal even if its quality wasn't to his taste. The top shelf in the Sub-Zero refrigerator was dedicated to various brands of coconut water. The shelf below housed some nondescript cardboard boxes, prepared meals. Jimmy hadn't eaten food in years. He looked around. Shelves upon shelves of wine glasses behind clear glass cabinet doors glinted back at him in the sunlight. There were 2 wine refrigerators and a small wet bar on the side of the kitchen opposite the sink. This had been a house for parties. How long ago had this been his kitchen? How many months or weeks or years ago had he maneuvered around the built-in island, arms full with bags full of groceries, or stood stirring a chicken stew with a glass of wine in one hand? Back to the refrigerator. Aluminum cans of Perrier, lemon and original flavor respectively, filled both the fruit and vegetable pull-out bins. At least whoever was doing the actual shopping had decent taste. It would have been a real disappointment to have found some off-brand drink, Coca-Cola, or worse, vegetables, slimy, molding, and rotting in the bin. No vegetables at all told him something. The people who came here didn't really stay here, didn't reside here. Jimmy lived alone. And Jimmy didn't eat vegetables. He was one. So, at some point, those bins that were in a previous life filled with organic green apples, fresh mint, cucumbers, celery, and pears, or leeks and spinach and black kale, became soft drink dispensers. Jimmy and the protectors of the expensive organic produce come soft drink dispensers had both seen brighter days. The last fruits and veg he'd brought home had probably gone to waste. Nobody wants to eat a sick man's food. Those beautiful, crispy vegetables had gone wilted and rancid instead of becoming a part of a meal painstakingly prepared by a man who loved food as though it were a woman. On the remaining shelf were food storage containers. Lasagna. Was this the same person who brought the fried chicken? Jimmy didn't guess so. In the freezer was vodka. Big bottles, too. A good brand. Jimmy's brand back in the day, but he was pretty sure that he didn't buy these. Whoever they were had planned to either throw a house party or drink. A lot. There was time left on the microwave. 4 seconds. Probably someone who was impatient and decided that it was hot enough. Probably the fried chicken person. Jimmy looked inside the trash compactor. A bunch of cardboard. Jenny Craig. A mental picture of the home care worker was starting to develop. He turned away from the kitchen to explore the rest of the house. The wallpaper was done in a tasteful but lively pattern in bright blue and steel gray. There was a light tap on the window as the wind blew and a few old leaves off the gutter. There was a light tap on the window as the wind blew a few old leaves off the gutter into the pane. Jimmy turned the doorknob on the door to his old room, the basement. Surprisingly, it was just like old times. Despite being closed off from the rest of the house, the air in the room wasn't stale. Jimmy guessed that he had the air conditioning to thank for that. He looked at the thermostat on the basement wall. 65 degrees. He wondered if it was the same upstairs, though he knew from experience that it wouldn't have mattered much to him in his comatose state. The concerns of creature comforts were no longer his, and hadn't been for some time. But for how long? Jimmy reached the bottom of the stairs. Sunlight filtered through the hopper windows, letting in a surprising amount of sunlight. As a boy, this had been a magical place. He'd have plenty of room to practice his martial arts. Well, he hadn't actually taken lessons, but he liked to pretend, and he pretended enough that the time he'd gotten into a scuffle, he'd been able to punch and kick the shit out of the other guy. He, of course, had never told his parents about his victory. It had been a difficult sacrifice to make. He'd felt so proud. But even at the tender age of 11, he knew that once he told his parents that he'd beat somebody up at school, things would never be the same. So he'd kept his victory a secret, but it was still a victory. Whatever happened to that other kid? Probably dead by now, or in prison. Kids that start violating that early have issues. That kid he beat up had been calling him names. He couldn't remember why. It could have been anything at that age. He'd seen his friends, 2 brothers, beat each other bloody because one called the other a genius at school. It hadn't been meant to be an insult, but Michael's good grades had been his secret. His brother had let the cat out of the bag. Michael was a great athlete. It was his identity. He also excelled at academics, but at school, he didn't want to be known for that. Michael wanted to be known for smoking weed and selling it and for having a big dick. He'd started flashing it around at school once he got some hair on his balls. People usually laughed when he did it, and usually at the person who'd had the startling shock to see it. The looks on their faces. Priceless. But more than being a funny joke, it became a part of his persona. Whether it was because of all the laughs, admiring looks from the girls, the cajoling attention, or the pure thrill of exhibitionism, Michael seemed to enjoy it just as much as the rowdy individuals that rooted him on. It was questionable behavior. But hey, Jimmy considered that if he'd had hairs on his balls that early, he might have wanted to show everybody too. But since he wasn't hung like Michael, it wasn't likely to have given him, or anybody else, any thrills. Michael, actually Michel, his family was French, wasn't Jimmy's closest friend, but he was Jimmy's favorite friend at school. When they'd gotten older, Michael and his family had moved away. They basically kept in touch until Michael moved back to France. Jimmy hadn't promised to come visit when he and Michael had said goodbye, but he'd always had it in his mind to surprise his friend, to show up on Michael's doorstep in Paris as if he just happened to be casually passing by. Jimmy liked to imagine his friend's surprise, tried to imagine what Michael would look like, old and fat and losing his hair. He'd often wondered what had become of Michael, but not enough to look him up. Michael might have asked him to come to Paris, and Jimmy would have felt obligated to fly to France to pay him a visit, which he knew he would have enjoyed. He probably would have fallen in love with Paris and wouldn't have wanted to come back. In the wake of Paris, an upper-middle-class life in Los Angeles, Jimmy was sure, would have lost its appeal. Starting his life all over again in Paris would have required a confidence too far, even for Jimmy, who left Michael's invitation to Le Paris to collect les poussières. That means dust. Leaving the city of Paris unexplored. Jimmy thought about Paris a lot after Michael moved away. He figured Michael had probably gotten married right away. Jimmy could even see Michael having kids. Michel he had probably become once again. Forever cool without trying, at school, Michael dismissed invitations to hang out with other boys during breaks, choosing instead to smoke cigarettes and teach Jimmy dirty jokes in French. In the hallways, he spoke French exclusively to his brother and the few teachers who could understand. It was meant to be exclusionary, but that hadn't affected Jimmy. It had brought them closer together. Speaking French was something he shared with Michael that most of the other kids couldn't. It made Jimmy feel cool. And there were other benefits. Jimmy was taking French, and with Michael talking to him en français whenever they spoke, he aced every test, pop quiz, and exam without studying. The first time Jimmy's father had come unannounced into the basement to get something, and seen Michael and Jimmy both hunched over a textbook speaking French, his attitude toward the long-haired boy with the nicotine-stained fingertips had instantly changed. Jimmy's mother suggested they should pay Michael something since he was directly improving Jimmy's GPA, but Jimmy's father, while generous in many ways, was cheap when it came to spreading his dollars around and wouldn't go for it. However, he did always offer Michael a ride when he stayed over past 9 o'clock. It was payment in kind. Michael seemed to see it for what it was. Even though he didn't really need a lift, it wasn't really too far to walk home and not a particularly dangerous neighborhood. He never turned down the ride. Jimmy figured it was Michael's way of showing respect. Jimmy was comfortable in his own manners, but he admired his friend's cultured European sensibilities. Women of all ages adored Michael. Old, young, teachers, small female children. One day at the park, where Jimmy and Michael went after school to spar, a little girl had run at Michael screaming. Before they could figure out what was going on, the little gidget had run right up to Michael and made a confident and gravity-defying leap into his arms. And without hesitation, Michael had bent down and caught her. He hugged her tight and swung her around in his arms before handing her over to the flushed woman who'd fallen to the ground twice, trying to catch up with the toddler and intercept her. She looked terrified, until she'd gotten caught up in Michael's eyes. The woman, it turned out, was just the babysitter. Michael dated that girl for 2 weeks before he'd gotten her pregnant. It wasn't the first time. He was casual about it, but not cavalier. He said he loved her, but he said that about all of his girlfriends. There wasn't one girl Michael had gone out with that Michael had broken up with. During their one conversation after Michael's move back to France, Jimmy made a joke to Michael about moving to Utah so he could legally have more than one wife, and Michelle had laughed and told Jimmy, in French, that in France, even poor men have at least 3 wives. Jimmy hoped that his friend, last he'd heard a budding film director, had found his 3 wives and was somewhere old and rich and not in a coma, slinging his great old wrinkled dick around, laughing and both scarring and scaring the nurses. Paris. He'd intended to go, but never made it. It's the end of the 2nd chapter of my book, Afterlife. It's available on Amazon. It's coming soon to iBooks, but you can get it right now on Amazon. You can read the first 3 or 4 chapters free, maybe even 5 chapters. You can definitely read free. And buy the book. It's $4.99. You'll be supporting me. I would appreciate it so much. I'm going to be live streaming again next Thursday around the same time. Look for me around 3 o'clock if you want to join the live stream. I am going to take a peek and see if anybody has any questions on the live stream. And the new videos will be up, so like a nice, more polished video of this will be up on Monday. So if you miss the live stream on Thursday, you can come back on Monday and watch the video of the chapters, and I'm going to read all of the chapters. I'm going to do all of the voices and make it entertaining for you. So thank you for staying with me. Thank you for hanging out. Definitely tweet at me. I'm on Twitter. I'm Maximilian on Twitter, MAXXIMILLIAN. And I'm on Tumblr. I'm like everywhere. But definitely tweet me or leave comments on my YouTube page. It's the best way to get a hold of me. I do have Facebook. I'm not on it as much. So the best ways to reach me is to tweet at me or to leave me comments on the bottom of the YouTube videos. I watch all of the videos. I watch all the comments. I read all the comments on all my videos. So that's it. I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for being with me and listening to my book, Afterlife.
You should always be aware of any authority, institution, government, church, religion. Anyone who is in the position of any authority that tells you that you should not read something in particular, or you should not look at a set of facts or a particular book. Because usually anyone in authority who doesn't want you to read something in particular must have something to hide. Because the intellectual mind of the human being cannot grow if it is not allowed to look at all of the facts.